Hi, my name's Paul Nelson. I spoke before about the history of Rockaway, and today I'm going to share the story of Tahoe Tavern, which is also in my book, House Grand Resorts of Old Lake Tahoe. For background, Dwayne Bliss, one of the most important people in the history of the lake, he moved to Gold Hill outside of Virginia City for the Comstock Silver Rush, started a small bank there. He was given the task of funding and building Virginia and Truckee Railroad. And then he noticed that there was a real need for timber in the mine. And so he bought a sawmill in Glenbrook, pretty much clear-cut the eastern shore. And he would haul the timbers up the hill with his own railroad, and he produced a huge amount of timber for the mines. But in 1890, the Comstock load ran out, and he found himself with an empty meadow on the lake and a lot of empty timberland and a railroad that went basically nowhere, and he decided to do something totally different. He noticed that tourists from Virginia City would come up and stay in a couple of small hotels that were built there in Glenbrook, and that the timber steamboats would take them out for tours around the lake. So he got the idea to build the biggest steamboat, which was the SS Tahoe, and then to move his railroad from Glenbrook over to Tahoe City and run a line from a pier extending into the lake along the Truckee River down to the Truckee railhead so that he could transport people. In that process, he noticed that there was a lot of traffic going to Tahoe, which was the major resort of the lake, and got the idea that he could build an even fancier hotel next to his pier, and he could get all of that business taken away from Tahoe. So he decided to build a hotel. And his son, Walter, was a very accomplished architect. Among other things, he designed the Southern Pacific headquarters building in San Francisco and St. Francis. And so he had his son design the most elaborate hotel ever at Tahoe, called the Tahoe Tavern. And he undertook this at age 60. The hotel opened in 1902. His first year was a disaster because he knew nothing about running a hotel. And the hotel took a huge staff, had every amenity you could imagine, including a movie theater and a bowling alley and a billiard hall and dining and everything you could imagine right on the lake. And so after the first year, he hired Alice Richardson, who owned the Mission Inn down in Riverside, which was one of the great hotels of California. It was primarily a winter resort, and so she was able to operate that during the winter and then come up and operate the tavern during the summer with her husband. And they had great success. One of the innovations that Alice had was called it Come As You Are. Basically, people could come into this elaborate, beautiful dining room after being out hunting, fishing, hiking, dressed as they were. One of the challenges of running the Tahoe Tavern was that it was a seasonal hotel, and Bliss had put a lot of money into building it. He actually had a mortgage on his railroad for $5 million. And Dwayne died in 1907, shortly after the hotel opened, and one of his sons took over operation. But the family decided to sell the tavern in 1926, and the buyer was a gentleman named Daniel Leonard, who was styled himself as the world's greatest hotelier. He owned the Fairmont Palace Hotels in San Francisco, and Huntington in Pasadena, and for a time, he managed the Ritz-Carlton hotels in Europe. He was a very high roller in the business. The other thing that was going on was that Leonard's hotel operation had recently been purchased by Southern Pacific, and that took over operation and ownership of the tavern, and also the steamships, including the Tahoe. They also had the idea of opening it for winter operation, and so they built California's first ski area, more of an exhibition and tobogganing area, which is Grand Levacan ski area today. But that did not prove to be profitable just because the hotel was a summer hotel. It wasn't insulated properly, and cost of upkeep and heating and maintenance was simply greater than they could take in revenue for the people coming up. And they continued operating it through the Depression. That became very difficult because no one could afford to go to the lake. And then in World War II, the gas rationing made it that much more difficult for people to drive to the lake. So it remained a difficult proposition to make money. And Southern Pacific brought in Matt Green, who was a local contractor. He built Winchwood and Vikings Home. He had wanted to buy the tavern when Southern Pacific bought it. And in time, he bought it from Southern Pacific Leonard. And they kept it open through the 1960 Winter Olympics, but then closed it and began demolishing it. But on Christmas Day in 1964, it all burned. It was spectacular. They brought in Heinrich Bull to design the new Tahoe Tavern condominium development. That has now been here for longer than the original tavern existed. This is a map of the tavern as it exists today. And we saw the arc of condos with the big grass area here, which was where the actual Tavern Hotel stood, and the steps that go down to the pool and the pleasure pier. If you see this road coming down here, that was actually the path of the railroad that went down to the rail pier, which sat right about here. So now we're going to go walk down to the area where that rail pier actually sat, just so you can see what it looked like. This was where the railroad was. Right in this curved area is where the rail pier went out, and they would back the train out onto the pier.
So this area right here.
Yeah, this is where the hotel itself actually sat. And Heinrich Bull had the idea of putting the condos in an arc so that everyone would have a view of the water. Now, this is the original stairway from the tavern that went down to Pleasure Pier.